everything's shortened these days, isn't it? From a full name to a convenient acronym word. But anyway, so STAR is there. We will also look to engage where it's appropriate with the private sector. We will look to engage, as we all do, as we do already with the voluntary and community sector. And we give have over £50 million worth of grants out there to voluntary and independent groups. So we will look to have a mixed economy, and we will look to have a mixed approach, and local commissioning is one part of that, but it's not the only game in town. So just to be clear on that. In terms of what we're trying to achieve, several things. First is very much about developing the role of the local member. I think it's fair to say that the role of the local member has changed quite considerably in the last 4 years, and certainly since we went into a unitary authority back in 2009. And the focus has been certainly to become much more as a community leader and leading communities in developing what's right. And we've had a strong focus on locality working and the wider localism agenda. We've also, going forward in terms of local commissioning, their role changes again, where they actually become local commissioners. So they actually have the ability to commission, where appropriate, services at a local level alongside the key partners in that locality. So it's not them doing it on their own. It's very much, again, that sort of team approach, that together approach of commissioning in localities. It doesn't mean that every single service will be commissioned locally. But it's already being shown that there will be opportunities to commission services locally. A key part of this is very much about making things more efficient, is very much about reducing demand on our services. It goes without saying the current economic climate we're in. It goes without saying the current economic climate is likely to continue until at least 2019 by the key analysis and those people that horizon scan that far ahead. We're being told that in terms of the public sector, whichever government gets re-elected in 2015, that we will have to find similar savings to those that we have found already. So we've by the end of March next year, we will have achieved the first round, if you like, of those savings as part of the comprehensive spending review, 86 million, which equates to about 28% of our budget. And we're being told that we're going to have to find the same levels again. So we could adopt a straightforward 28% cut across all of our budgets and manage it that way, or a different approach is the one that we're adopting here around local commissioning. It's also, what we're trying to achieve is really coming at this from the customer's perspective. Now, we all work in the public sector, so therefore we're all very much focused on the customer, so that goes without saying. But what we've discovered already is that sometimes some of our layers that we add in the way that we do things inadvertently gets in the way of the customer, slows things up, devalues what we're doing. That's not a criticism of us all working within the authority, because I think we're all very much focused on the customer. Because of the layers that have been built up over time, it actually slows things down for the customer. So this is very much coming at it from the customer's perspective and with a real focus on customer value. The other thing I just want to mention on this particular point is it's about doing with, not doing to. And I know that's a fairly common term that we bandy around in the work that we do from time to time. But again, the work that we've been doing is very much about engaging those local communities in lots of different ways and encouraging them to get involved so that they are part of what we're doing, they understand what we're doing, they own it, and also help shape how things could look differently in the future. And that's, again, takes a bit of time at the beginning, but is now proving quite rewarding in what we're trying to do going forward. There's a real focus as well about keeping jobs local. So when we eventually get to commission, different ways of working, and more about that later, the focus is very much about keeping the jobs in Shropshire, keeping the pound, the money spent in Shropshire. So a real focus on the economy of Shropshire is at the forefront of what we're doing. And clearly we want to keep learning throughout. We're starting in one community, as you're probably aware, which is Church Stretton. Again, for those that weren't at the first meeting, there was no sort of scientific rationale behind why Church Stretton. It was a debate had by Cabinet at the time, and initially some other market towns were put forward, but eventually Church Stretton was chosen upon. But essentially it's the approach that we're interested in, not necessarily the market town, because each market town will throw up different demands in those respective areas. So in terms of the approach that I was just touching on there, this is a traditional approach to commissioning. Again, for those of you that have looked at commissioning on the web or in various textbooks, it tends to follow that sort of cycle. Sometimes it's clockwise, sometimes it's anti-clockwise, but it tends to follow that cycle that you can see behind me. If you can see behind me, I should move out of the way. It's focused. The work that we're doing is taking us around to being commissioning ready. And commissioning ready is the procurement element there at the 6 o'clock mark on that commissioning cycle. That doesn't mean that we're not going to have any due regard to what goes on after that point. Absolutely we will. But the work that we've been tasked with, which was to get Church Stretton commissioning ready by the end of June, is that point. So it's very much about understanding the needs, resources, priorities, and then redesigning a different way of working. We've slightly finessed, if you like, that approach, and you probably can't see that at all, but it is on the intranet, that slide. This is the approach that we've taken in Church Stretton, and it very much is a sort of a twin-track approach, getting to that very grandly titled Decision Accelerator session that you can see there, and again a bit more about that later. But for those that can't quite see, on the right-hand side is very much focused about what we know, and understanding what we know through a whole range of different methods. But that's our starting point. What is it that we know about a locality? What is it that we can find out about that locality? And we can find that out predominantly through what we would call hard data, so the data that we've got, statistics, the various analysis that we've got, the place plans that we've got, the town plans that the town council might have developed. So it's very much starting with that hard data, and then turning that crucially into intelligence. What is it actually telling us about that locality, and where can we start to focus down? We could have just gone straight down that route, which is the traditional route, but what we've actually done is overlaid that with customer engagement and customer involvement. So again, getting that, moving from that done to doing with approach. So here we've had a strong focus on engaging with the local community. We've had a strong focus on ensuring that the decisions are made at a local level as well. So we've developed a local governance board that is chaired by one of the elected members. There's 2 elected members in Church Stretton, in Councillor Lee Chapman and Councillor David Evans. There's still the same 2 elected members after the elections. And Councillor Lee Chapman chairs the local governance board. And the local governance board make all the key decisions at a local level. So again, shifting that decision making away from the centre, if you like, and down to the locality. That local governance board is also made up of a range of key movers and shakers, for want of a better word. There's people that both commission but also deliver as well in that locality. So for example, we have on there a representative from the Registered Social Landlord, South Shropshire Housing Group. We have a representative from the secondary school, the head teacher. We have 2 representatives from the Town Council. We have 2 key providers in the locality, South Shropshire Furniture Scheme and the Mayfair Centre. We have the police, we have the fire service, we have the CCG, and we have public health. So quite a broad mix of people in that local community that are making decisions and ensuring pace. And that local governance board meets on a fortnightly basis. Again, we're doing things differently, so there's no papers, which is a bit unusual. Lots of visual presentations. That doesn't mean that we're not keeping or holding ourselves to account, but we're trying to do things slightly differently in the way that we move this forward as well at pace. So there's a strong focus on engagement. We've engaged very much with the local community, and we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. But we've also got that community involved as well, so that they can go out and start to ask some of the questions that we've been asking, and also to get involved in some of the prototyping, which is the next stage that we're coming on to. And what that leads through to is the Decision Accelerator session, which is a session that I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, which is where the key decisions of those first few weeks of work took place. The other thing I should have mentioned is the level of pace that we're going at, which again has shifted a lot of people out of their comfort zones, I think it's fair to say. I quite enjoy working at pace, but this is breakneck speed, and has been on occasions. And we actually started on the 11th of February, and we had until the 20th of April to get ourselves ready for the Decision Accelerator session, which lasted over 3 days. And we're now into the prototyping stage, which you can see below that line, and I'll come back to that a bit later on. I'm going to prototype different ways of working over an 8-week period. So it is a completely different way of working, and I think it's fair to say that in terms of our partners, that level of pace has been not the norm in the way that they work. If I can be as diplomatic as that. Okay, so a bit more about the Decision Accelerator session. In terms of the purpose, that was very much about sharing the story, so the work that we captured in the first 8 weeks, 9 weeks, from mid-February through till April. And I'll talk through those in a bit more detail. So that was the primary focus. Secondly was a willingness to change. So a real focus for those people that were in the room for a willingness to change. Do we want to accept, having heard what you've heard, what we've been doing, or do we want to change and change together? And the third was very much for them to give permission for frontline workers to prototype new ways of working collectively together. So that was the key sort of 3 outcomes that we were looking for the Decision Accelerator. In terms of the audience, we averaged about 30 people a day over the 3 days back in towards the back end of April. We had the Leaders Board representatives there. So the Leaders Board is a board that comes together on a quarterly basis and is made up of the leaders of Shropshire public sector services. So you've got James Tozer from West Mercia Police, Paul Raymond from Shropshire Fire and Rescue. You've got Clive Wright and Keith Barrow from Shropshire Council, and so it goes on. Voluntary Community Sector Assembly, Business Board are all there, CCG, Public Health. So they were all in the room to varying degrees over the 3 days, and also in the room were those representatives that were on the local governance board that I was referring to earlier. So if you like, those key leaders that can make key decisions right at the very top of all of our organisations across Shropshire, as well as those key decision makers to make things happen at a local level. So that was the audience. And in terms of the approach over those 3 days, it was very much about day 1, talking through the stories, day 2, is there a willingness to change, and then day 3, getting those leaders to start to shape those high-level action plans for the prototypes. So really, getting them bought into the willingness to change. And in terms of those outcomes, again, I touched on those earlier, but it was very much a desire for all to change, very much for a commitment for all to change, and to have at least one prototype developed at the end of day 3 of the session. Okay, so I'm going to talk now in a bit more detail about each of the 3 stories and a slight recap as to how we got to those, so that you can hopefully get a feel for the approach that was undertaken. So day 1 was very much about telling those 3 stories. And if you like, that's the point that we got to by the 20th of April. But we didn't start there. We started, as I was referring to earlier, on the data. So we looked at the data that we had for Church Stretton, all of that high-level data, all of that hard data. And as you can imagine, there was quite a lot of it, predominantly from within Shropshire Council, but we also had some from Public Health, we also had some from West Mercia Police, we also had some from Shropshire Fire and Rescue. And as the time went on, from the 11th of February onwards, we were able to capture more data. But interestingly, we're still not quite there with all of our partners. So we started this back on the 11th of February. I had my first meeting with the GP practice in Church Stretton last week to get them up to speed, because as you can imagine, around health, they are a key player in understanding what's going on in a local community around health. But obviously they will understandably have their concerns around customer confidentiality with some of the data that they hold. But we started with all of that data, and as you can imagine, there was a whole wealth of it. And again, we were looking at where are there the spikes in demand, where is there the greatest need, having looked at all of that data. So basically what we started to do was funnel that down. So we were able to start funneling down within Church Stretton where there were those key areas of high demand. So for those of you that know Church Stretton, you'll be aware it's a market town in the south of the county, population of about 4,000. A higher than average number of older people living there, and so it became apparent that there appeared to be quite a strong area of need, high levels of demand around that sort of health, social care area. The other thing that sort of probably surprised us and may surprise you is the spike in unemployment that's happened in Church Stretton over the last 10 years. And whilst we know that unemployment has gone up generally across the county in the last 10 years, in Church Stretton it's gone up higher than normal, particularly around those young people not in education, employment and training, and also NEETs, again, a nice acronym that we shorten, and also long-term unemployed. So long-term unemployed had gone from something like 12 to 45 in Church Stretton. So again, that was something else that we decided to look at in a bit more detail. The third area was very much being reflected by the early messages that we were getting from the engagement that I was talking about earlier. So when we were starting to go out and talk to people about what they liked about Church Stretton, what they disliked about Church Stretton, what frustrated them, what they enjoyed, what they wanted more of, we realised that there was a common theme coming through, and everyone loved living in Church Stretton. Anyone live in Church Stretton here? No. Well, anyway, if you did, oh, you did?
Well, yeah, you used to, but moved it south.
All right. Well, I don't know whether it's the same with you, but he's moved away, so maybe he doesn't still live in Church. But most people that we talked to loved living in Church Stretton, and what they loved about Church Stretton was the place. It was clean, it was tidy, it was nice to look at, no crime. So it's that whole sort of public realm type thing was very much a factor of the good side. However, again, when we looked at some of that data, and some of that data is also looking at what the services that are going on in an area and the spend that's going on in an area, we realised that there was an awful lot of people making Church Stretton clean, tidy and safe, particularly those people that were involved in cutting the grass, cleaning the streets, managing street lights, car parks and so on. So again, that was another area that we decided to look at in a bit more detail. So, we'd agreed that there were 3 key areas that we were to look at. I should stress there was a lot more, but in the time frame that we had, we knew we had to get to the end point of the 20th of April, having got to be able to tell a story around those 3 key areas. So again, you probably won't be able to see that very well. That's a slide of part of the work that we did for the first story on living independently for longer. So in terms of that, we knew that there was high levels of demand around health, social care in that area. So again, playing back to focusing on the customer, what we decided to do was look at a customer, or in this case it was a couple, that were in receipt of adult social care services in Church Stretton. So again, key principle of the way that we've been working is about engaging the frontline staff. So there's been a real focus on talking to the frontline staff in those respective areas. So we were able to work with a social worker in the south of the county, and using Care First, which is the software package that we record all of our interactions with our customers within adult social care, we were able to start to understand the couple's interaction with Shropshire Council from the first time that they put their hand up to say, "I need help," to actually right up to the present day, and their last interaction with Shropshire Council was on the 4th of April this year. So what we did is we looked at all of that information that was on the Care First package and also their case file, and we developed called a customer journey map, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may have done. And basically it was on lots and lots of pieces of flip chart, and running along the centre was the timeline from 2006, which is when the couple first put their hands up, onwards. And each intervention was plotted on that timeline. And then the actions were detailed above that timeline. So somebody putting up their hand, so in this case it was Mr. A, putting his hand up saying, "I need a visual impairment assessment, please." Because he had diabetes and was also visually impaired. He was also a full-time carer for his wife, who had dementia. They'd been married for 50 years, lived in Church Stretton for 60 years, I think, and in the same house for 50 years. So that's a bit of context about the couple. And so we started to map all of their interventions with Shropshire Council. Whether that was with an occupational therapist, whether that was with a social worker, whether that was with somebody that needed to do around visual impairment. But also, there were also some other interventions with colleagues from benefits as well, when they needed to have a benefits check on their means to pay for some of the services that they were asking for. So we mapped that out, and that took about 2 days, one person plus one other person, 2 days to map that out end to end. We then looked at that and realised again that there were some natural or unusual peaks in demand, both in terms of how they were living their lives, but also on our services. And one of those areas was early on, where they wanted an assessment to have an external ramp put in so that they could gain entry and egress from the front of their bungalow to help them to live at home. And that took, on the timeline, when they first put their hand up saying, as a customer I need help, to when that ramp went in was 12 months. And I'm not a social worker, I'm not really, not worked in adult social care or health, but to me looking at that looked a bit odd. And again, there are a number of other spikes on that customer journey map that we could have looked at, but we chose to look at that one area and to look at the whole process of aids and adaptations, how we go about adapting somebody's home to help them to live longer in their own home. And that's what essentially that piece of work behind me is there. So again, we worked with an occupational therapist and colleagues from private sector housing, which are the two key areas that were involved, and we started to map the process, the end-to-end service process, from the very first moment, which is, you won't be able to see this that well, but here is the very first post-it note saying I need help from the customer, and depending on whether they need a minor adaptation, is something under the value of £1,000, so that could be like a grab rail, which costs about £280. So if they needed a minor adaptation, they would follow a relatively short journey to here. If they needed a major adaptation, which would be something, well, it was anything over £1,000, but I'll give you an example. It could be an external ramp, could be a level access shower. Level access shower is about £3,500. The journey that customer goes on starts there. They actually get their works completed here, and then, but in true fashion, the journey still carries on beyond that within other service areas. And we mapped that with frontline workers who know that process. And first of all, we mapped it with the occupational therapist area, which tends to be in this area here. So in that initial assessment, and then with the housing colleagues, which tends to be there on inwards, although the occupational therapists, the OTs, do come in at various times. And it was interesting that from an occupational therapist viewpoint, what was wrong, everyone sort of accepted that it wasn't ideal, the current practice, but each sort of saw it from their own eyes, which is what you would do, I think it's fair to say. And it wasn't until we mapped it out and everyone could see the big picture, as far as the customer was concerned, that it became quite stark. So a customer that wants a level access shower will have 21 individual visits into their own homes from different people over that journey. We discovered that the average waiting time varied. For a minor adaptation was about 5 months. For a major adaptation, the average was 12 months. But some are 2 years and waiting at the moment, still within the system. We've got a budget of about 1.5 million that we spend on DFGs, disabled facilities grants, to help enable people to live independently in their own homes. And we discovered that just short of £1 million was spent on process. Just short of £1 million was spent on process. Not on the customer, on the aids and the adaptations, but on the process that wraps around and is in all of that. And that's the other key part that we did with this piece of work, is we costed it. Because obviously, going back to the point I was making earlier about reducing demand, about being as efficient as possible, we need to understand the costs now so that when we redesign, we can measure that and they are delivered more effectively in a far more streamlined, single-pass approach. What we also did is we spoke to Mr. A. Mrs. A unfortunately passed away in February of this year, but we spoke to Mr. A, so we overlaid his customer journey, if you like, in terms of facts, with how it felt to him as a customer. We also looked at random a number of different cases within the DFG process in the last 12 months and took out real life examples at random. We didn't cherry pick the worst. And again, we understood those, and we went and spoke to some of those customers as well. And every customer was absolutely over the moon with what they got. Absolutely over the moon, which is great. So the end point was great. It was just the time it took to get there. Some of the other things that we discovered in some of those case studies, if people want to ask me at the end, I'll share, but they were not great reading from a customer perspective. And I need to stress, this isn't about criticising services, this isn't about criticising individual service areas, this is about understanding what we do for the customer and how can we make that better for the customer. So, if there is anyone in those fields in the audience here, please be assured this isn't about criticism, this is about understanding. This is about understanding what we do and how we can do things better, more efficiently for the customer. So that was quite a stark story to tell around just one element of Mr. and Mrs. A's involvement with Shropshire Council. What we want to do is overlay that, because that's only part of the story. There are also people that will assess customers for aids and adaptations when they're coming out of hospital, for example, and also the district nurses as well that are out there in our communities. What we're planning to do is overlay that to get, because as you can imagine, when you start to overlay that with other service areas, I'm guessing the processes will layer up again, and I'm guessing, based on what we found already, that the costs will layer up again. And yet we're all probably, well not probably, we are all dealing with the same customer. So that was the first story that we told. That by the way, is probably thinking that must have taken forever to do. That took, the key is frontline workers, backwards and forwards, the key is frontline workers to tell that story. I'll take questions at the end, is that okay? So just hold that thought. That took a graduate and an OT worker and an OT worker and somebody in private sector housing about 4 days, full time, to do. And then we sense checked it with middle managers and the directors as well, just to make sure that we hadn't missed anything or there wasn't anything that was factually or wildly incorrect. So yeah, sorry, I will take questions, but there's quite a lot for me to rattle through. Life cycle of disadvantage was the second story that we told. So again, there were no papers, by the way, for this session, this Decision Accelerator session over 3 days, but all visuals as well. Again, when we started to look at the needs element and long-term unemployed element, what we decided to do was to actually take a much wider holistic view of potentially all of the different customers that could be in there, that could be affected if they are disadvantaged. So we started from pre-birth, so young mum that's pregnant, which is on the far left-hand side, right the way through to somebody 70 years plus. And at certain timelines, we discovered, if you were incredibly unlucky, but some people are in this, will have different elements and be disadvantaged for a whole host of reasons. So what this visual describes is the issues. This is the timeline. So young mum, birth, 4 years, 11 years, 18 years, 25 years, 35 years. You get the story. All of these individual lines in different colours are the different service areas that interact depending on where you might be. And I'm running across the top the different areas of disadvantage that you might have: substance misuse, crime, poverty, low-level education, poor health, poor diet, and so on. And then what we did is again, with focusing on the customer, is we actually developed 3 real-life against 3 customers that are known of what it meant to them, and costed that out, how they were living their lives, what it was meaning to them, and put some cost to that. So we had a young mum, we had somebody that was a NEET, and we also had Mr. E, who was 54 years of age, living in Church Stretton, been unemployed, in and out of work for the last 24 years, not done anything wrong, just not been overly keen to work, was currently costing us all, taxpayers, about £20,000 a year. And when we spoke to him, he was perfectly happy with his life, absolutely perfectly happy with his life. But was already starting to show signs at the age of 54 of a deterioration in health, and therefore was going to start to obviously have a knock-on effect to local GP, possibly wider health services. So again, we were able to tell that story in some detail. That took about, again, looking at all of the data and costing it all out, and some of the costs that we got were national costs that were already out there. That took about a week to do, full-time, people working on it full-time. The third area was public realm in Church Stretton. Again, another visual. So this is a map of Church Stretton and the main town centre area of Church Stretton. And it's not that clear. For those of you that are in Shire Hall and want to pop into meeting room 1 of the West Wing, all of these visuals are up on the wall at the moment, so feel free to pop in at any time and have a look. But what we did there is, again, we decided to look at the data, who was doing what, how often, to what level of standard, and how much it was costing in Church Stretton. And essentially, in terms of the public realm in Church Stretton, you have Shropshire Council, you have the Town Council, you have the South Shropshire Housing Group, you have the Probation Service, you have voluntary organisations. There's 7 different voluntary organisations involved in doing stuff around public realm in Church Stretton, the main one being Pride of Place, Church Stretton. And also on the periphery you've got the Highways Agency, although we sort of, and Network Rail. We took those last 2 out because trying to engage with those 2 is a challenge in itself in the time frame that we had. So we just focused on those 5 areas, and we started to build a picture of who was doing what. So some examples, and again, anyone that's working in these areas, this is not a criticism, this is about understanding what's going on. So we discovered that the voluntary group, Pride of Place, people say that voluntary groups aren't sustainable. This voluntary group has been going 10 years in Church Stretton, meet every Sunday, once a month, go out and litter pick for about 2 hours, and then at the end are given a free breakfast in one of 4 cafes in Church Stretton, who do that on a rota basis, and they can see the benefit because obviously it's keeping their town tidy. Which I think is a fantastic example of that real sort of social empowerment of people really want to do things for themselves, and the community giving something back. Absolutely brilliant. Doesn't happen everywhere, I know, but that was a real brilliant example that we discovered. So they litter pick on that 4th Sunday. On the previous Friday, we've gone out and litter picked as part of our own contract, and the following Monday we go out and litter pick. So we litter pick 5 days a week in Church Stretton. So I'm guessing when the voluntary group go out, and they actually proved this when they came and spoke to us, that actually the level of litter that they pick up has dropped since 2009, when everything changed and we started street scene services within the new unitary authority. And I'm guessing our team on the Monday after the Sunday are also finding not a lot of litter to pick up, I'm guessing. We've discovered that there was an awful lot of sort of reactive work going on, so every time somebody rings up and says this hedge is overhanging, or this tree looks a bit dangerous, every time that happens there's a cost of that of £18. And you can't see on that map, but the number of stars, as we put them, for reactive work is just peppered, absolutely peppered. We also measured how many people in 1 month walk around a particular street in Church Stretton. Feet on the street is what we called it. And again, you can't really see it, but it's this sort of horseshoe street here. 109 feet on the street, pairs of feet on the street in Church Stretton, which works out about 6 people a day walking around that street. Doing lots of different things. So this highlighted to us that it was great, it was very clean, it was very safe, it was very tidy, but look at how many people are involved in doing this. Isn't there a better way of making the best use of those people that are there, the best use of the money that we're currently spending? So, what we then did, once I get to mine, is we left day one having told those 3 stories and then moved on to day 2. So again, same people turned up again. Days ran from about 9:30 till 4, but day 2 was a slightly shorter day. And in day 2, we asked the question to the people in the room, do you want to change it? Have what you've seen is fine, because if it is, we'll go away and we'll carry on as we've been doing. Or do we want to look at a different way of doing things? And are you committed to change as leaders, whether you're leaders at the top of the organisations or leaders in the local community? And they said yes, which was great. So then we went into, okay, from a customer's perspective, we actually sort of badged everyone in the room, Shropshire PLC. They were very much there, working collectively together for the benefit of Shropshire, for the benefit of people living, working, visiting Shropshire. So over the duration, they became Shropshire PLC, which seems to have stuck. And from a customer perspective, so if you're asking a customer, what is it they want from you as leaders, in the way that we are going to do things differently. And so that they didn't start with a blank sheet of paper, I crafted a sentence, which I thought was quite good, as I would do, but that was soon thrown out. And actually they said, no, if it was a customer, they would keep it very short, very punchy, and so that's basically what they came up with. Better, faster, cheaper, together, and with a focus on prevention. Better, the way that we do things; faster, the way that we do things; cheaper, the way that we do things. We being everyone, not just Shropshire Council. Together, so not in isolation, although sometimes there may be the need to. But the crucial thing is the focus on prevention. And I think we get so wrapped up, and I can speak from experience, in the here and now, that we forget about how we can try and do things differently, so that we avoid the here and now and some of the crisis stuff that we have to deal with. And then, for the remainder of the day, it was very much a focus on the strategic outcomes for Church Stretton. And for those, these are a bit wordy, they came up with them. The creation of opportunities to work and become work ready, leading to an economically vibrant and work ready community. That was the first one. The second one was a quality public ground that people valued and are proud of. And the third was people to live independently in their own homes for longer. So they were the 3 strategic outcomes for Church Stretton, linking back to what they'd heard on day 1 around those 3 stories that I've just touched on. So that was the end of day 2, and then day 3, we moved into designing the prototypes. And the prototypes were, again, developed by the leaders and in groups for the day. And it was very much the who, what, why, where, when of a plan, but a high-level plan. Ultimately then to give permission and freedom to frontline workers to do things differently with the customer at its heart. And the only rule they had was they mustn't break the law. We've added another one, actually. Anything that's got a safeguarding issue, we're not going to touch as well. But because we've only got 8 weeks, and that I think is sensible to leave out of the equation. But at the time, the only rule was you mustn't break the law. So, in terms of those prototypes, the first one was over 6 months. So the prototype is to run for 8 weeks, but the measurement will be over 6 months. Over 6 months, that we will reduce unemployment levels in Church Stretton from its current level of 45 to nil, which is a very ambitious target. The second prototype is around that pride of place and creating a safe and well-maintained an area that people are proud of by a single team that is responsive to local needs. And the third prototype is around living independently for longer. So the term is having some conversations with people at different levels of need in their community, and having those conversations with a multidisciplinary, locally based team. So they were the 3 prototypes that were developed, and work started on that 2 weeks ago, and we're already making good progress. There will be the first conversation with the multidisciplinary team with the customer tomorrow. So 2 weeks after being given permission, as you can imagine, there's been a bit of getting the key people together into this new team, but the first conversation is to happen tomorrow. That doesn't mean they're going to start to have loads of conversations. They're going to have one conversation with a customer, understand what their need is, agree the action with that customer, and then deliver. Because essentially, when we ask for a service as a customer, that's essentially what happens when we interact with a provider. They understand what it is you need, they agree the action with you collectively. Does that meet your needs? Is it the right price, etc., etc.? And then it's delivered. So that's the sort of principles that are going to be adopted for these prototypes. In terms of the public realm one, we're planning to start again. There's been lots of work behind the scenes getting things ready, but the new team will start 23rd of May in a small discrete area, but on the 23rd of May. In terms of reducing unemployment, we have our first event. What we've done already is we've established how many people there are. So we have a figure of 45. We've looked at all 45. We've got a dedicated worker from Job Centre Plus now working with us on this, which is a massive, massive step forward we've not really had before. And we've established that actually of that 45, that drops down to about 35. There's about 10 people, for a whole host of reasons, are either leaving the area, about to go into employment, or fall actually live beyond the Church Stretton geographical remit that we're looking at. So we're starting with a baseline of 35, and we're having our first event. All of those 35 have been written to, or been spoken to. So of those 35, there's about 18 that are long-term unemployed. Long-term unemployed is those people that have been unemployed for 12 months or more. And there's about 17 that fall in the period below that. They've all either been spoken to or received a letter. We've been invited to an event later this week, where we spoke to a bit more, and each one the following week will be assigned a mentor. So every single one of those 35 people will have a mentor. And they will work with them to, first of all, by understanding what their barriers are to employment, work with them to, whether that's upskill them, develop their confidence levels, develop their employability levels, develop their skills levels, to get them into employment. We've also started to talk to local employers, not just in Church Stretton, but again in the immediate area. We're also factoring in transportation, because that's a key barrier. So we're looking at transportation within that. And what we plan to do with all of those 3 prototypes is measure the success at the end of the day over 8 weeks, and whether we have improved things for those customers, whether that's living independently at home, whether it's getting them into employment, or whether that's actually still maintaining that quality of public ground in Church Stretton, but actually reducing the number of feet on the street and costs out there. Excuse me. So the next session in June, we'll talk a bit more about what we've been finding in the prototypes. It's still a bit too early to say now about what we've discovered, because actually the action on the ground starts, as you've just heard, this week. So in terms of the next 8 weeks, as I say, there'll be the delivery of the prototypes. We'll be measuring the impact of those prototypes. The other thing, the rule, the other sort of focus, the key principle that the people that are in those teams developing it, they're all frontline workers, by the way, developing the new ways of working. And they're all, in some instances, existing service providers, because this is about getting commissioning ready, and you need those service providers that currently do the current world to potentially be doing the new world, and have not been involved in helping to shape the new world. It's going to come as a bolt out of the blue when we go to commission out this new way of working. So they're very much involved, those service providers out there, frontline workers that are out there, customers that are out there. But essentially, if it's not better, faster, cheaper by working together with a focus on prevention, then they shouldn't be doing it. So any element of their work over the next 8 weeks, if it doesn't hit that focus, as far as Shropshire PLC is concerned, they shouldn't be doing it. In terms of just concluding, we're going to have when we've done this 8-week period of prototyping, we'll be reporting back to the leaders again in the first week of July, and that's when some of the key decisions will be made in that next phase. We're also at the moment considering where we roll this out to next in terms of local commissioning, and also where there may be some specific high demand areas that are again aligned to a community as well. So just talking to directors and after this Thursday new cabinet as to where we ought to be focusing our efforts. So, that you'll be pleased to know. Oh no, it's not. Damn, I thought I finished. What does it mean for me? This was a slide that I shared in the first presentation back in April. And you probably are thinking, okay, well I've not really got involved in this, and either my service is already commissioned out, or I've got a back office service that I'm running, so what does it mean for me? Well, certainly local commissioning, as I was saying earlier, is not the only game in town, but this approach of working, of coming at it from a slightly different perspective, there's a real focus and a real drive to do that more and more. And it doesn't need a team to do that. It can be done in your existing teams. So there's no reason, once you start to understand the approach, is to start to think, how could that approach, that way of working, apply in my specific service area? So you may want to raise it at a future team meeting. we may want to just reflect on it, discuss it with colleagues. But it's very much about understanding that approach and how it can apply in your respective work areas. And obviously, it's been said, it was said back in March last year when the Cabinet paper came out, the Shropshire Council will be a commissioning council. That's been re-emphasised again, most recently in January of this year. So we will be a commissioning council. We are going to deliver far less than what we've delivered previously. At the moment we both commission and deliver, and now we're going to be predominantly commissioned. Although there will still be some elements of delivery, I'm sure, within Shropshire Council, but far, far less than what it is at the moment. So it's about having that thinking, understanding this approach. The easiest way to understand it is to do it. So going back to the beginning, when I first started this back in mid-February, I didn't know what each stage was going to present. So when I started to look at that high-level data with colleagues, with Kate and other colleagues, I didn't know what areas we were going to then have to drill down into. Didn't know it was going to be around, I had a good idea based on the demographics, but until we saw the data around health, adult social care, certainly didn't think it was going to be around unemployment, and wasn't sure around the public realm one. So it's very much, so it's not like we can prescribe a training course, it's not like you can prescribe a toolkit to do this. The easiest way to do it, the easiest way to learn about it and to understand it is to do it. So whilst these sessions are useful to help stimulate the grey cells, the quickest way that I found is actually getting your hands dirty and doing it. So I was involved in helping to shape the customer journey map. I've been involved in the engagement sessions, the involvement sessions. I've been actually out there, front line, shaping this, doing this. Which is how to accelerate my learning. There's still lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of questions out there that I'm still working through, like scalability, normalising this. But as I say, the easiest way is to get your hands dirty and start to do it. And there is support. You know, there's more and more people starting to do this within the authority. Not loads, there's what, 6,500 people that we employ, and there's probably been on and off 50 people involved in this. So we need to accelerate that. Right, this is the last slide now, which is questions. I know there was one.
Yes, I've got a couple of observations. I think this is an absolutely fantastic approach to take. It's really good that this is becoming a pilot for us all to learn. It follows an analogy that I'm from Star Housing, by the way, but I'm also part of Sustain.
Yeah.
And this type of model was one that we floated 18 months ago in terms of supporting people commissioning. The way that we wanted gatekeepers to try and draw in those local delivery models, systemic innovation, and to look at the effectiveness in terms of cost against delivery. And I just wonder, is there a real commitment to get this rolled out? And what are your timescales? How do you bring in those more rural communities?
Yeah.
Because those are the ones that tend to add the pound signs onto any delivery model, and cost efficiencies just don't stop at the market gate,
Yeah.
the market town gate. And my other analogy is you seem to be focusing on those medium to critical cases,
Yeah.
which draw most of the personnel.
Yeah.
But what we do know is, in terms of the preventative, which is where my focus is, there's a greater number of people who fall out of and rely on carers,
Yeah.
unpaid,
Yeah.
charities, and support grants.
Yeah.
So just really, there's a few thoughts there. Just wonder if there's any response from you on those.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. No, good questions. In terms of commitment, the other thing was prevention. So in terms of commitment, this is being led by Keith and Clive.
Yes.
It's been endorsed by Leaders Board. I think the level of commitment amongst some of our partners is at different places, I think it's fair to say, but is accelerating. Those that aren't quite at the same level as we are is accelerating, I think it's fair to say. We had a session purely aimed at directors and heads of service last Thursday, so we did a full day session with directors and heads of service last Thursday, and they've all been tasked with looking at this in a bit more detail, and they've been given some specific themes to look at. So I think the commitment is very much there, and that's why I would encourage you to go away and give this a bit more thought in your teams. In terms of timescales, that's a good question. I think it's going to be, I suppose in my own head, is that this will be an iterative process, so we're not just going to stop in Church Stretton at the end of June. We will start to look at other areas and that work will continue. But in terms of timescales, we want to do another 4 communities starting in June. And then, now, that was incredible detail, that first community, and we've learned from that where we don't need to apply necessarily all the same levels of detail in all the same areas. But many hands and many big brains make light work, so that's what we need. We need more people owning this and getting involved, because that's when people start to do this as the day job, and I'm not blind to know that there's the existing day job, so that's a challenge. The culture changes and the speed and pace changes. So I'd like to think that this will be the way of working, the normal way of working in the next 12 months. But that's probably a challenge on all of us, really. Rurality is an absolutely spot-on question. When we chose Church Stretton, what I didn't mention is the geographical scope. That was one of the first things we had to agree. And everyone was assuming that we would do the place plan area, which makes sense. We've got a wealth of data around our 18 place plans. But what we discovered, or what we felt, was that we needed to start smaller than that, really. The place plan area of Church Stretton is quite broad and goes into quite a broad rural hinterland, as indeed a number of our place plans do. So we wanted to start quite tight, and so we took the town council boundary area. And we took that for a number of reasons. A lot of the Office of National Statistics data lends itself to that. A lot of our partners' statistics lends itself to that. The community understands that as part of that sort of community engagement involvement piece that I was talking about. So we do know that when we do the next 4 areas, that rurality element that you quite rightly say is going to be key. Having said that, some of the data that we've captured, particularly around health, adult social care, we've been able to understand rural isolation, what that means to older people, for example, living on their own, in their own homes, and the sort of the asset-rich, cash-poor that a lot of older people are, and again, that's quite prevalent in Church Stretton. So, but you're absolutely right, the rurality element we need to factor in next time. It's more because of the speed that we have to work at to get to the point of the first session, with the Decision Accelerator session. In terms of prevention, you're absolutely right. That's why I brought this slide back up. Basically, when somebody puts their hand up and says, I need help, they go to they ring the customer service centre. So most people are signposted to the customer service centre. It's called First Point of Contact, FPOC. And depending on some basic questions, they will either get signposted to a second point of contact, which is here, or if they don't meet that certain criteria, so going on to your point about eligibility, they get signposted out of us and get signposted to a number of organisations in the voluntary and independent sector. So one of our first call next week is not going to be somebody that's signposted in, but it's somebody going to be signposted out, because we want to understand their levels of need, and actually, even though they don't meet our criteria, financial criteria predominantly, we could actually be impacting on other services, other partner services. So, for example, it could be that somebody doesn't meet the financial eligibility for an aid in adaptation, but when we go and talk to them, has already fallen over twice in their own home, and has had 199 call out to A&E, and so it goes on. So we would, so we've got a current processing that means only certain customers come into us. We want to understand it from the customer per se. So
no, that's fantastic. And it's music to my ears that you're going to follow that other pathway, because at the moment there isn't any support overlay onto the care pathway. And it seems as if we have support, care and health eligibility teams and centres where we could be more efficient and have the one.
yeah,
And I would advocate that is somewhere in a locality we could try and achieve, rather than the big picture all at once, because it's so frustrating where people just come to a blockage.
yeah.
So that's fantastic, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Hi, Barbara.
I love it. I agree that culture and I love the quote it all the time. The big question I have is around costing and how we manage to do it. From a personal point of view, I want to do exactly the same thing. So
Yeah. It's been the toughest, or one of the toughest tasks that we've had so far. The crucial thing is that we've had one colleague that's been our single point of contact in the finance team, Debbie Price, who's the pensions manager. Some of you may know Debbie. And she's been absolutely brilliant in understanding what we're doing, and then going and talking to all of those finance colleagues and really starting to unpick how much things actually cost. I think it's fair to say that when something's in a locality and has a building and staff assigned to it, so let's choose a library, that's an easy one to choose, that cost is relatively well defined. You will have other costs around that, so some of the IT support, some of the development support that we will have to apportion, but that tends to be easier to define. When you've got a social worker, let's say, that's covering the southwest or the southeast, and might only have 2 clients at the moment in Church Stretton, but who knows how many they might have coming up, that becomes more problematic. And initially we were told that it's too difficult to break those costs down. So what we then said is, okay, if it's too difficult for the service manager to break those costs down, then we will break those costs down with some proxy measures. So we will have a go at doing it, and we don't know your budget, but we'll have a damn good go, or you can have a damn good go with some proxy measures and give it to us. So there's been some healthy debate, I think, with colleagues in some of those certain areas. And that's where a lot of the challenges come in, to be fair, at a middle manager and a senior manager level. How accurate are those costs? So we've been very careful to work those through. And that's the difficult thing with our partners as well, trying to really understand how much they're spending. But again, the DFG process, we were able to state with some fairly robust calculations. In time-honoured O-level tradition, probably not many of you done O-levels out there, we show our workings out, so that when we're challenged we can show our workings out, so that people can again unpick those if they want, challenge those if they want, make them better, that's fine. So some of the figures that we've had, one of the figures reduced from 400, that figure's wrong, it was something like 460,000, it dropped to 430,000. Well, still about 400,000, it didn't drop massively. It was, so yeah, it's been key to have that point of contact. But Debbie's, if you speak to Debbie, Barbara, she's been brilliant.
that's great.
Any other questions? Conscious we only allowed an hour or so for this, so no? Okay, so keep looking on the intranet. There's some commissioning pages on there with this presentation on. Steve's been attempting to film me as I've been dodging around. So this will be going on as well for those of you that haven't been able to, for your colleagues that haven't been able to get here. We'll do another session in June. I think we're just finalising the dates. Again, if there's sufficient demand, we'll go out and about around the county as well. And yeah, get involved is what I would encourage you to do. Thank you.